read the motion.
That this Assembly is ashamed of the long suspensions of devolution over the last 10 years, accepts responsibility for the decline in public services that have taken place over that time, apologises to public sector workers who have experienced pay injustice over the last 10 years, resolves that the functioning of the Assembly and the Executive should never again be subject to the veto of a single party, and calls on the First Minister and Deputy First Minister to include a specific commitment to reform of the institutions in the programme for government.
The Opposition, Matthew to move the motion.
Moved, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 1 hour 30 minutes for this debate. The proposer of the motion will have 10 minutes to propose and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. Please open the debate on the motion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to open the debate on the first opposition day of this new mandate. Opposition is a natural and healthy part of democratic politics, and we intend to perform that role, as we have done thus far, constructively. During the negotiations that led to the creation of these institutions, Senator George Mitchell famously pledged to bring his then newly born son back to Belfast one day to watch a sitting of the Northern Ireland Assembly. Senator Mitchell said, "I hoped we would watch and listen as the members debated the ordinary issues of life in a democratic society: education, healthcare, agriculture, tourism." Senator Mitchell was able to fulfil his wish in 2012 with his then teenage son. But when he returned in last year for the 25th anniversary of the agreement he helped broker that created this Assembly, there was no Northern Ireland Assembly to observe. Because for 5 of the past 7 years, there has been no devolved government in Northern Ireland at all. Today's motions from the SDLP in our opposition day are about preventing that ever happening again. Because if it does happen again, if these institutions do collapse again, I'm not alone in believing they will simply never re-emerge. Those of us in politics and the media often focus a lot on the party political impact of one decision or another. What does this mean for the DUP? How might Sinn Féin react to what the DUP does? How will the rest of the parties behave? These are legitimate and necessary questions in a democracy. But taken to an extreme, a fixation on political standoff leads us to the situation where public services, and indeed the public themselves, are of secondary importance. For nearly a decade, party political standoff and veto has allowed our public services and our public realm to decay and in some cases collapse. I scarcely need list the litany of problems that beset our public services, from the worst healthcare waiting lists in Western Europe, to chronically underfunded childcare, to special educational needs at breaking point or beyond. None of these problems were created by storm and collapse, and none of them will be solved merely by the return of devolved government. But all of these problems, all of them, along with virtually every other public policy challenge we face, has been undeniably made worse by the absence of devolved government, the absence of ministerial decisions to decide priorities and allocate budgets accordingly, the absence of a multi-year spending programme to allow health service leaders to recruit doctors and nurses on a long-term basis, the absence of any funding guarantees until the last minute for large parts of the community and voluntary sector. Though we are all, at least the vast majority of us, pleased to see devolved government return, we cannot pretend that public trust in the very idea of this Assembly and Executive have not been profoundly damaged. They have. In a recent survey conducted by Queen's University, only a third of voters thought the Executive would survive until the end of this mandate. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is an extraordinary statistic. Despite the positivity around the restoration of Stormont, only 1 in 3 people think it will last 3 years. That statistic should shame all of us in this chamber. That level of cynicism and distrust is exactly why I asked the First and Deputy First Ministers to pledge to not resign their office before the end of this mandate. That wasn't a stunt. I was asking a question that most of our citizens want to know the answer to. Madam Chair, our first motion today begins by expressing shame on behalf of this entire institution for its repeated collapses and the profoundly negative consequences they have had for ordinary citizens, workers and public services. To be clear, that isn't about assigning blame, but it is about acknowledging a collective failure of the political class to deliver stable and sustainable government here. To anybody who thinks we should simply leave the rules unreformed after nearly a decade of chaos and devolution only functioning for a few years out of that, I would simply say this: are you serious? Can anyone argue with a straight face that we are fine as we are and should just plough on regardless? As that saying goes, the first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem. Madam Speaker, it is worth unpacking some of that problem. We all know there are divergent narratives of Irish history, but most of us should be able to agree that, tragically, Northern Ireland has been marked by division between people throughout its existence. There was, of course, division before partition. These institutions were created after nearly 30 years of violent conflict. That conflict itself came after half a century of one-party rule, which excluded one community from virtually all political power. Indeed, at times, that exclusion seemed to be the motivating purpose of the state. That hugely difficult inheritance is why we negotiated a system of power sharing, of government based on inclusion rather than exclusion. And as the party that did so much to shape the Good Friday Agreement, we don't agree with those who think that power sharing, or consociationalism, as it's known among academics, are in themselves the root of our problems and our dysfunction. To take such a view is to willfully ignore history, including the manner in which this jurisdiction was created, as well as ignoring the reality of a post-conflict society. But it is possible to reform and change the way power sharing works in order to provide a basic guarantee that there will be a government in the first place. Our reform motions today are designed to complement and implement one another. The first motion I am moving acknowledges the harm done by repeated collapses, then pledges two things. Number one, the principle that no single party should ever again be able to collapse the institutions at will. I don't think that's unreasonable. And secondly, that the programme for government should contain a specific commitment to reform. Our second motion, which I will address in more detail when I move it later on today, creates a specific vehicle for producing legislative proposals on reform, namely an ad hoc committee required to produce a report on options for removing the single-party veto by September this year. I'm sure there will be opportunities for us to debate and me to answer some of the questions around those proposals during the course of this debate. But, Madam Chair, our motions do not prescribe an exact model of reform of the veto, but a number of options have already been publicly advanced. And here I would acknowledge the work of the Alliance Party on this agenda. They have proposed an opt-out model for parties that qualify for one of the top two roles but do not want to take one. The NI Affairs Committee at Westminster proposed a series of related changes, some of which would undercut, though not completely remove, the current veto. Many of these ideas, such as a move to supermajority voting as opposed to cross-community voting, were based on SDLP proposals. No one party can or should own reform. By definition, we need to achieve some degree of consensus in order to make it happen. There are multiple routes to reform, but we do need to agree today that the first and most urgent change has to be removing the power to collapse government and not making it conditional on other concessions. The protections in the Good Friday Agreement are supposed to build confidence, not reinforce mistrust. The purpose of power sharing is supposed to be positive partnership, not negative veto. It has been said in recent days that the heavy lifting on this work needs to be done by Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State. We strongly disagree. A Tory Secretary of State, working out his notice, will not do this work for us. We need to do it ourselves. I'm not going to give way at the minute, but I will give way later on when I wind. I'll answer any questions, but I'm not going to give way in at this stage. A Tory Secretary of State, working out his notice, will not do the work for us. We need to do it ourselves, starting with these Opposition Day motions. And let's remember, Madam Chair, the First and Deputy First Minister, the Finance Minister are now themselves engaged in a process of negotiation with the Treasury over the financial settlement, one in which we as a constructive opposition have said we support the asks you are making. But let's be real, one of the reasons why the Treasury and this Tory government have been able to be so cynical in their treatment of these institutions and politicians here has been because of the repeated cycle of collapse. In order to build not just credibility with the public, in order to reinforce our ability to negotiate with the UK government and others, we need to have sustainable political institutions and not institutions that collapse so routinely. So, as I said, a Tory Secretary of State working out his notice will not do the work for us. We need to do it ourselves, starting with these Opposition Day motions. Let's protect, I will give way in my wine speech, I'm happy to give way to anyone who didn't get in at this stage. Let's protect the best of the agreement and reform the veto that's undermining trust in the rest of it. The photo ops and positive vibes of the past month have been welcome, but we've seen this movie before, and rather than wait for the nasty plot turn and not-so-shock ending, let's change the script. Let's never again plunge our public services and our people into the vortex of no government and no hope. And I commend this opposition motion to the Assembly.
Thank you, Matthew. Our next speaker is Deirdre Hargey.
Yeah, thanks very much. And today's motion refers back to the last 10 years and references the decline in public services in that time. And indeed, our public services and the workers who sustain them are part of the bedrock of our society, along with our people, communities and our local economies. Ensuring they can operate on a sustainable footing and addressing need and, importantly, driving aspirations are essential. Therefore, in doing so, addressing the underlying root causes impacting on our public services is critical, particularly when you look at events over this past decade. But what I find bizarre in this motion when looking at the impacts on our public services and the cause and effects, there's no mention at all of the British Tory government and their regressive policies. When we look back over the last 10+ years, we have witnessed a number of societal shocks. The impact of the financial crash, Cameron and Osborne's Tory austerity policies, Brexit, COVID, global events and the cost of profit crisis. And when you look at all of these shocks, some of which were deliberate in policy intent and political choices, you see the impact they are driving in terms of poverty and inequality, and how their effects disproportionately impact on certain sections of our population, our women and children, those with disabilities, our working class, our minority ethnic communities, and indeed our older people. The Tories' chosen policy of austerity has and is having a devastating impact on public services. Countless research has shown the impact of savage Tory cuts on public services and their ability to respond, not just here, but also across England, Scotland and Wales. Billions of pounds have been stripped from public services since 2010, and this has had deadly impact and consequences. Research has shown that Tory austerity policies since 2010 were the main cause of the decline in the rate of which life expectancy has increased. A further review showed the impact of Tory austerity on health, our health system, which is causing increased poverty, unemployment and homelessness, and as a result putting considerable strain on our health service and its ability to respond. We have again seen this exacerbated by Brexit and the loss of essential European funding, which again targeted those most in need. And today, here in this building, we can hear the Equality Coalition who are showcasing the need for an anti-poverty strategy due to these impacts being felt here. This has also been backed by the women's movement and the wider community and voluntary sector that see these impacts in terms of Tory cuts. The Executive has protected people by mitigating against the worst excess of Tory cuts, and challenging this must remain our priority, and we need appropriate funds based to address this need, particularly as was stated in a post-conflict society. This was the commitment given by all Executive parties and indeed by the opposition on the 4th of February past. In the joint letter to the British Treasury, signed by Sinn Féin, the DUP, Alliance, the Ulster Unionist Party and the SDLP, which called on the need to make immediate and durable changes to our funding arrangements, to deliver on public sector pay, deliver a fiscal framework and, importantly, plan for fiscal sustainability. If we're seriously to address the underlying root causes of inequality and indeed developing world-class sustainable public services, then we all must work collectively to address the funding shortfall, challenge austerity and transform our public services to meet the needs of our workers, families and communities. That's what the public really want us to be doing here today and in the days ahead, and that's where our focus is and will remain so.
Thank you, Deirdre. I call Jonathan Buckley.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker, and I suppose firstly, happy Opposition Day to all members across the House. I think given the immediate media attention that there's been in the topic, we should actually define what the opposition is. It's the party that lost the election. Now, I know Sinn Féin the SDLP have a significant record in this regard, going from being the largest nationalist party in this place to the second largest nationalist party, and perhaps given recent polling regards the Alliance Party, maybe even the third nationalist party of the chamber. But the motion before us today, we had weeks, we had months trailed. Mr O'Toole was clinging to the desk of his official leader of the opposition title at the whim of whether or not the Ulster Unionists or indeed the Alliance would take that place. They chose not to. So the duty of responsibility lies with Mr O'Toole. And I thought we were being told that we were going to have a constructive opposition, one that relished the opportunity to hold government accountable on the bread and butter issues. Are we really seeing now the real political priorities of the SDLP? No motion from the SDLP health spokesperson, Mr McGrath, on health waiting lists and constructive suggestions on how to bring them down. No motion from the SDLP education spokesperson, Ms Hunter, on the much-needed capital investment for new schools and indeed special educational funding challenges to date. No motion from the Public Accounts Chairman, Mr McCrossan, on huge concerns in the Northern Ireland Audit Office report. I think we will hear plenty from the official opposition shortly. And again, finally, no motion from Mr O'Toole, the Chair of the Finance Committee, in relation to the budget. And we understand in such a week where we have a UK budget being set out later this week, surely a motion outlining those concerns would have been the people's priorities rather than petty point scoring from the official opposition. Instead, members, what we have is a motion on proposed changes to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, the party of supermajorities rather than accommodation. Is this now the real party of John Hume? I think that question needs to be asked. Turning to the issue of reform itself, we do not deny that the challenges presented in terms of stability of the institutions, the length of time the Executive and Assembly has not fully functioned over the past 25 years is regrettable. However, we cannot lose sight to the fact that we live in a contested space, emerging from decades of terrorism. Success is not always guaranteed in this regard. This is a reminder of the need to preserve rather than destroy the delicate balance of community relations that is interwoven into strand one of the agreement. Issues of instability, regardless of what political party it may come from or community, can often be complex, as has been seen in most recent times. Let's look at the most recent issue of instability. We had arrangements foisted upon the people of Northern Ireland in which not one unionist democratically elected could support. Not one. If we had a similar situation arise whereby it was, for example, nationalism that had an issue, would that likely lead to a similar outcome? I mean, the SDLP MP Claire Hanna was on record of saying that in such circumstances. No, well, it's true. I'll speak to the record, actually, to the Leader of the Opposition. You cannot imagine that people would take that without a minimum of civil disobedience, at a very minimum. The inescapable truth, members, is that we live in a contested society. Absolutely.
That we are dealing with a situation where it's a mandatory coalition in Northern Ireland. It's an imperfect system, but it's one we have to work with. It means compromise and working together on issues.
The member has an extra minute, and please, could people stop shouting from sanitary position, please?
I thank the member for his intervention, and it leads me on to my next point, which is the inescapable truth is that we live, I'll have to continue to get through, to live in a contested place. The best way to defend the institutions from collapse is ultimately to ensure that we talk about issues that are affecting everyday working families. our frontline workers, our schools children, as well as protect the most vulnerable in our society. This is where the programme for government priorities should be. It is not coincidence, but by design, that the mechanisms for review are not only built into Strand 1, but rest outside of the Executive. This reflects the real need to ensure that all members and parties have a stake and the space to give attention to them. In closing, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, consensus politics will be the only way we can stave off instability. The political arrangements in Northern Ireland must be capable of commanding the broad support of all traditions across our province. The motion before the House simply implies that devolution could still operate and succeed outside these parameters. That is fanciful, to say the least. Cross-community consent has been essential to achieving progress in this province, and it should be viewed as the solution and not the problem. Thank you.
I call Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Unlike the previous speaker, I'd like to say that we in the Alliance Party are actually delighted that this is the first topic chosen for debate on this opposition day, as it reflects the Alliance Party policy and priority of long-standing. And we will, of course, be supporting the motion. And I would just like to welcome the opposition to this discussion, and just to emphasise just how long-standing it has been our party's position around meaningful reform. I have right here, members, a document called Agenda for Democracy that we in the Alliance Party published 20 years ago today. And it is remarkable how how prophetic it was. Even before St Andrews Agreement, it sought fundamental revisions, not quick fixes. The quick fixes since, as the proposers themselves will agree, have only made things worse. Go ahead.
Outlining her party's commitment to ensuring the reform of these institutions. Could the member remind the House during the collapse in 2017 to 2020 how many times her party recalled this Assembly to try and move on, to try and get this Assembly back up and running when one party was blocking its return?
The member has an extra minute.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. Well, you obviously weren't a member then, and the issue at that time was that we were renegotiating getting us back, and we did call for it many times, and we did take things forward. But the argument you had with the UK government over those 2 years was not one that could be solved in this chamber. And shame on you, shame on your party for the impact that has had on our public sector. We have seen a decline in that, and for you to hold the whole country to ransom over your party issue is absolutely shameful, and we will feel the effects of this for generations to come. So, Prince.
Point of order.
In order for the member to address her comments directly at me, and I know obviously she was a member of the Tory party, unlike me, but could you correct the member to see if she can address me directly on her comments?
All remarks should be done through the chair, but I believe we need to just accept that this is a cut and thrust of debate. And if you have an issue regarding what I've just said, then go and see the Speaker. But I would encourage members just to look as if you're talking through the chair. Go ahead.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker, and I was responding directly to the comments. So, our Agenda for Democracy document, some parts of it have actually been implemented, including the reduction in departments and devolution of justice. But so, where the document is still relevant is that it sought an executive founded, like almost any other government in the democratic world, through negotiation and compromise. Taking into account our particular circumstances, the idea was that any coalition should be able to take office provided it had the support of a weighted majority in the Assembly, which would ensure that it was inclusive. And 20 years on, I would suggest that idea's time has come. It would remove the ability of a single party to wield an all-destructive veto that we saw over the last 2 years. And parties are entitled to opt out of government, but they are not entitled to force others to opt out too. Weighted majority voting, ensuring an inclusive government, but also a genuine choice for the electorate, would also enable the abolition of communal designation. Even back in 2004, that was seen as a crude form of institutionalised sectarianism. And in 2024, it is entirely inappropriate for a modern post-agreement Northern Ireland in which we actually live and in which people are choosing even more often to step beyond the old dividing lines when making choices in schooling, in leisure activities and indeed in the polling booth. The point here is that designations do not just mean that cross-community votes, whether arising from the application of a petition of concern or otherwise, take a crudely sectarian form where other votes are deemed to count for less, and thus people opting to vote neither unionist nor nationalist are blatantly discriminated against. And I would say it is not right that the electorate who vote for the Alliance Party are effectively disenfranchised on important votes. So these votes also mean that the institutions do not function in a manner befitting the actual post-agreement electorate. My party colleagues will come back to much of this, but I do want to turn to another issue that we raised in our 2022 manifesto. Here, as in many other policy documents, there is a fundamental recognition that our system of government relies perhaps too much on allocating every policy area to a particular department, and too little on a genuine sense of collective interest and collective responsibility. And I do think it is on the First Minister and Deputy First Minister and the Executive Office to look at this, because we do see far too much silo working here in the Assembly and in the departments. So what is required, therefore, is recognition from all of us, including the proposers, that there were flaws in the original agreement, and that there was a review mechanism built into it, and that was meant to iron these issues out, but rarely actually did. We do need to remove crude sectarian vetoes. That is objectively undeniable, but we also need to ensure that the institutions operate in a way that is befitting of the entire society they are supposed to represent, and we need to move beyond those silos. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Doug Beattie.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I rise to support the motion, I can fully understand the reason why it's worded the way it's been worded, because you're trying to get the maximum support you can possibly get. But I can't stand here and give cover to those who have caused a suspension over 5 of the last 10 years. And it's important that we say it as it is. 3 years of a boycott by Sinn Féin over a financial issue. Are we better off after that boycott? Are we likely to have another RHI again? Well, the reality is it could well just be around the corner. And in fact, the rot in our public services set in during those 3 years. And then 2 years of a boycott by the DUP over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Achieved nothing whatsoever of substance. The Irish border is still there. The European Union still has input as to what happens here in Northern Ireland. There are still checks taking place on goods arriving in Northern Ireland, and the custom posts are still there. But during those 2 years, our public services crumbled to the stage now where some of them in the short to medium term can't be fixed. And we have to be mindful of that. So no, I will not give cover to those who collapsed this institution and maintained a boycott. But what I will do is promise to work with them, with those in the opposition, with those in the Alliance Party, and for those who are independents or in the TUV or in People Before Profit. So it is the thrust of a conversation about reform that I support within this motion. Should one party, 25 years after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, have a veto over devolved government? Absolutely not. The system allowed it, I have to say, and you have to ask the question, why did the system allow it? Well, the system allowed it because in 1998, what we were trying to do was stop ourselves killing each other. That was the focus. We focused on the peace, we got the peace, but the politics didn't fit into place. Because after the Belfast Agreement, we should have amended through collaboration and negotiation into the future. Well, we didn't get that, apart from a few scrappy changes that did little to stabilise government and keep it from being collapsed at the whim of just one party. So what does reform look like in my mind. Everybody will give a particular view of what they think reform is, and we could debate every single one of them all day long, and I don't think that's what we're here to do today. But what I think reform is about a negotiation, an agreement, an agreed position, taking into account all of the political parties, including independents, including the TUV, including people before profit, including civic society. All of them have to feed into this, because remember, it was the people who voted for the 1998 agreement, and it is the people who need to have a say in what direction we go next. And just because we don't like somebody's point of view doesn't mean we should exclude them. I will not support exclusion of any shape or form. What it does not look like is... Yes, of course.
Member agree that it is not about exclusion, it's more about those who are not wanting nor willing to participate are choosing to exclude themselves and opting out. So rather than using the word exclusion, you might use self-exclusion or opting out of sitting in an executive.
The member has an extra minute.
I'm quite comfortable with the word exclusion. And the reason I say exclusion is because there are people in this chamber who absolutely do not support the Belfast Good Friday Agreement as it stands now. And it's important that if we don't listen to those voices, if we try to push them voices away, we will not get a full understanding of our society. So I'm quite happy to stick with exclusion. But what I don't want is another St Andrews Agreement. Because the St Andrews Agreement was a carve-up between two of the large parties behind closed doors, and it was a quick fix. It did not work. It has left us in a worse position. And the UK government and the Irish government were complicit in that, and they did so because they just wanted to get this place up and running and nothing more. Quick fixes will not work. You pull the thread and the whole thing could unravel. So this is about sitting down and thinking this through in the long term and getting all the voices that need to be added to this. The Belfast Agreement had its flaws. We know that. It was balancing the unbalanceable after so much conflict. But what we don't want to do is fall into the trap of just screaming reform, reform, reform without stopping and really thinking it through and seeing what reform will mean in the short, the medium and the long term. I'm up for that discussion. I don't think we should be afraid of that discussion. It doesn't mean that I am open to changing every single thing that needs to be changed within the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. It is still the bedrock of government here in Northern Ireland. But I'm certainly up for that discussion going forward, and I'm willing to talk to anybody inside this chamber or outside this chamber, those in favour or those against, because until we get all the views, we'll not really know the position. Thank you.
Thank you, and I call Harry Harvey.
Thank you, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker. I have listened intently to the points made thus far in the debate, particularly from the opposition on the issue of future reform. It has struck me how little interest or focus seems to have been placed on the principle of consent and how much would feature in reform as the SDLP would envisage it. I find that concerning, given the importance that the principle of consent has been to politics here for the last 20 years or more. It's no exaggeration to say that politics could not function in Northern Ireland without it. Cross-community consent has got us to where we are. We should not forget that. It has been essential to political and social progress and should be viewed as a positive influence. Cross-community consent and what flows from it is not the problem here. However, it feels somewhat that the SDLP and their recent road to Damascus-style conversion into opposition seem to believe that it is the problem. It appears that they now feel the need to fix something that the likes of John Hume and others from within their own ranks were so wedded to. The reality still remains that 80% of those of us around the walls of this chamber still designate as either nationalist or unionist. My party and that of Sinn Féin represent the bulk of those members. As such, wider support for both traditions in Northern Ireland remains the dominant force within politics and must be borne in mind if we are to sustain fully functioning institutions representing and delivering for the people who have elected us. The motion does raise a valid point in terms of the long-term stability of devolved government. No one can deny that stability has been an issue in the past and poses a risk to this House in the future. However, we must be honest in terms of the root causes of instability. During times when the institutions are not functioning for the good of everyone, when the institutions are not deemed to be representative of all communities, this is when stability is challenged. As a party, I believe we have evidenced in the past that we are not afraid of reform of the institutions where such reform is necessary. Indeed, there have been changes to the petition of concern, for instance, to take into account its impact upon Assembly business. It is incumbent upon us all to ensure that government works and is seen to work for everyone in Northern Ireland. We are the guardians of this delicate balance and the need to ensure that in a divided society such as ours, everyone is at the table. As has often been said, it only works when it works for all. We must therefore have this theme central to our focus on any discussion around future reform. If the plan is to simply diminish the voice or representation of one tradition in order to facilitate or bolster the rise of another, such changes will be doomed to fail. Mr. Speaker, it is good to see the Assembly functioning, or Madam Speaker, sorry. It's good to see the Assembly functioning once again and commanding the ongoing support of both Unionists and Nationalists. It is for us all to put our shoulder to the wheel and make it work for Northern Ireland. This will be achieved through delivery on bread and butter issues that matter to the public. Delivery is where our focus should be. Delivery will cement stability and progress. It is only then should we be advancing proposals in relation to reform. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, and I call Kelly Armstrong.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. I stood, in fact, I think I was standing in this place on the 19th of October 2021, leading a debate, a motion that was brought forward on reform. And everyone in this House voted for it. There was no division on it. This House accepted that. I stood then after a period of collapse following Sinn Féin. I stand here now talking about reform after a period of collapse under the DUP. The last time I talked about a demoralised workforce, I talked about how the harm that was caused to our services in Northern Ireland. I talked about the harm that was caused to carers, something very close to my heart. I talked about poverty. The same thing is here today. Nothing has changed in the last number of years, and we are continuing to fail the people of Northern Ireland because of persistent collapse. So how can we change that? And I think the way that we change that is by having sustainable government that cannot be collapsed by any party. Principal Deputy Speaker, the Assembly and Executive Review Committee in the last mandate prioritised reforming designations and the appointment of the First and Deputy First Minister. Sadly, there was no real appetite to take any action by any other parties to have the power to use their veto removed. Even after the Alliance motion was passed in this House, no party voted against the motion, but nothing was done to take forward the change needed to create sustainable government. AERC collected all the information, but nothing was actioned because kicking the can down the road meant the veto could remain. We could have mitigated against a single party pulling down the Assembly. We could have delivered change that would have protected the democratic institutions. In fact, I brought it up again at the first Committee for Procedures, and it was confirmed for me that the legal changes that will be needed to be brought forward to make the reforms in place will have to be done by the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and that is the UK Government and the Irish Government. If we are serious about these institutions, we do need to act now to ensure that this does not happen again. We need to deliver for the people of Northern Ireland. We need to step up for future generations to ensure our hard-fought political peace process continues to enable Northern Ireland to reach its full potential. The Good Friday Agreement is a foundation to peace and progress. It will and should involve our political structures to do so as well. Alliance wants to see the removal of designations and to change cross-community voting because the current system embeds division and creates instability. Why should my vote count differently to the rest of you in this building? Why is my vote not the same as a nationalist or a unionist's vote? Why in 2024 is my vote still different? Replacing parallel consent with weighted majority voting is an important change to reduce the significance and role of designations, and it's in the Good Friday Agreement. Society has changed. It is more diverse and inclusive, but yet this isn't reflected or respected in this House. You're only equal if you're nationalist or unionist. This is unfair and time to change is now. In the 2021 census, we can see the population is more diverse. Minority ethnic groups have increased in size, and the number of people living here who were born outside the UK and Ireland is up to around 1 in 15, the highest ever recorded. Those who are forced to identify as other, those of us who prefer to be called United Community, has increased from the 2021 census to the from the 2011 census to the 2021 census. There is no justification for the continuation of the designation system. Alliance also want to see how the First and Deputy First Minister are nominated. We want to update how we nominate the First and Deputy First Minister to ensure stability and sustainability of our institutions. We want to update, not wipe out, the 1998 Act, so that if a party who is eligible to nominate a First Minister doesn't want to do so, the entitlement can be passed to the next largest party. A party would be able to refuse the nomination without triggering a veto on executive formation. That is consistent with the current position of the allocation of the other executive ministers under de Hont. We are committed in the Alliance Party to stable and sustainable power sharing that respects liberal democratic principles and enables the development of a shared future. But as stated by Professor Paul Dixon in his written submission to the AERC, this process will require political skills and pragmatism in order to achieve a compromise that is deliverable and sustainable across the political parties. If this House agrees this motion, then I would love it if it had been built into it that the Speaker could write to the guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement and the UK and Irish governments confirming that it's the will of this House for an update to be made to the designation system and the definition of cross-community voting, so that I am not left out of it ever again. I believe that we must move forward to ensure an inclusive, fair and sustainable government for Northern Ireland.
To a close.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And the next speaker is Philip Brett, please.
Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, and can I congratulate the Leader of the Opposition on his appointment and welcome to his place here today. Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, we won't be party to a stunt which is using and abusing people's emotions over a sensitive issue. There has to be power sharing. They are the fundamentals to which we hold dear. Not my words, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, but the words of the Leader of the SDLP, Colm Eastwood, in this very chamber. Words of the Leader of the SDLP: we must have a power-sharing executive. These comments stand in stark contrast to the motion that we have before us. What has changed, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker? Is this a U-turn policy from the SDLP? Is this the Leader of the Opposition auditioning for a higher role within his own party? Or, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, is this the fact that the SDLP have been placed in the opposition by the people of Northern Ireland? Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no mention in this motion or in the contributions made by the SDLP to date of the collapse of the institutions which his party presided over following the Belfast Agreement. No comment whatsoever, but simple criticism of the executive. Of course, an executive for the past number of years, which the SDLP, of course.
Would you agree with me, but that it has been very damaging to public service delivery here in Northern Ireland with stop-start politics over the last 25 years, and that we have to do something to change that?
I would agree with the member on the point that the politics of domination has been very damaging for relations here in Northern Ireland. I would agree with the member that Northern Ireland only moves forward when all communities move forward together. And the lesson of the past 3 years should be that the concerns of a major section of our society cannot be simply ignored and papered over. And the only way in which we all move forward, happily give way.
Would the member accept that the feelings of the people who elected me first, as the first person elected to this House in the last election, have been papered over by the DUP? You stayed out of government You don't accept my votes in this House. How can you marry up what you're saying to what is the actual facts?
The point that I was making to the member is that the mandate which we were given was not simply just transferred to the DUP, or we did not make up our mandate. We were given a mandate by the people of Northern Ireland to take the action that we were given. But I must remind the member, it wasn't my party who brought the current settings and rules in which we operate to pass. Her party and others in this chamber campaigned for the Belfast Agreement, and these are its outworkings. We have managed to improve that through the St Andrews Agreement and through other agreements. However, the way in which we operate is a result of the conditions set out before us. I just want to make some progress before I give way to anyone else, Madam Deputy Speaker. So we have 2 years with the Leader of the Opposition in post, and not a single policy settlement put forward here. He proposes to create a new committee to which he will selflessly appoint the chairman to. So ready for opposition in the past 2 years that his contribution is to congratulate the Alliance Party's policy. Madam Principal Deputy Speaker, when the opposition was brought to this House, we were told it was a new age for democracy. We were told that people would be held to account. Instead, we have an attempt to use this motion to create another office to which they will fill. We have no meaningful proposals put forward here, and the lesson of the past 3 years must certainly be that Northern Ireland will move forward when all communities move forward together, and I would encourage the Leader of the Opposition, when he brings his next motion, to perhaps bring it on something that's relevant to the people of Northern Ireland, and perhaps at the next election he will no longer be in the opposition. Thank you.
I call on Nuala McAllister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the motion that's been brought before us today, and I'm glad that the motion has been brought and that the SDLP are joining Alliance in our calls for the reform of these institutions, and I say that in all honesty and without sarcasm, because it is important that all parties do get on board, and we do have the discussions for reform, but not just discussions and conversations, but we actually help to make them happen. I also want to point out the elephant in the room that has not really been highlighted today. These institutions are as stable today as they were the day before the last collapse. And the reason why we have seen not just Sinn Féin and the DUP over lacking of support of reform over the institutions, but the reason why we have seen others not get fully on board, and I appreciate that members of the UUP have said that they are supporting the motion but are unsure about the entirety around the conversation, is that I would point to the issue of power. The reason why people are so reluctant to give up that power of veto is because of control. If you are refusing to give up that power, refusing to reform the veto of the establishment of these institutions, it is for one reason only, because you want to use the threat of bringing down these institutions again. Hear, hear. We need to go beyond that type of politics in this day and age. We need to ensure that we have good governance and we have a respectful way of debating the issues that we all do not agree on. There is no one in this room who believes that they can get everything that they want at all times. But we see that not in reality, but except we see it in bringing down the institutions, that people act like they should get everything that they want. But they know it. They know that in any negotiation, the outcome will never be totally on your side. And we respect that in Alliance. We respect that through us calling for reform since 2004, since June 2022, when we published our proposals, we put them forward to the UK and Irish governments, that we're willing to have these conversations. We're willing to talk about cross-community voting. We're also willing to talk about designations, because it is not for, as my colleague has just outlined, that the votes of the people who voted for the Alliance Party are not counted in any cross-community vote. We need to ensure that we can move past that. But it's not just about words, it's about action. The member who spoke before me, and I speak through you, Principal Deputy Speaker, highlighted the Belfast Agreement, upon which many members in this room support, and I'm proud to say that we still support the Belfast Agreement, but contained even within that, at the time, were safeguards so that it could be changed, it could be updated, because time does move on. We all have our political priorities, but we cannot push forward our political priorities without the threat and the shadow in the background of bringing down these institutions. We wanted to be a bit more specific in the motion today, and we did attempt to bring forward an amendment, but we understand perhaps why the SDLP have not been specific, and so I understand that the Leader will be addressing some more issues in his winding, but I would like to hear from the SDLP if they would also get on board with the Alliance proposals of removing the system of designations, because that is particularly important. We've already discussed this in the public. Each and every one of us, and canvassing in the doors right across Northern Ireland, will have been met with the conversation around reform. We know that people support it. We know that people can get on board. So what I would say to both the DUP and to Sinn Féin is to not be afraid of what reform could mean. I know you may be afraid of losing your power and your control, but what is more important is moving this place forward and having an Assembly and Executive that it can actually deliver for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Sinead McLaughlin, please.
Thank you, Speaker. Since this place has returned, we have discussed and debated several issues that are central to people's lives in every part of Northern Ireland. We have promised to work together on childcare. We have pledged to end violence against women and girls. We have called on action on environmental catastrophe, and yet on each of those issues, and I would agree with the member for North Belfast, there has been a huge elephant in the room. And that is, at any moment, one of the biggest parties in this Assembly could once again exercise a veto on the progress that they claim to support. That nuclear veto that we are discussing today, and its repeated deployment in the last 10 years, has eroded public confidence in our politics, left public services in crisis, and forced workers out to the cold to demand fair pay. And I believe that it is a veto that we should all resolve to remove from our politics for good. After a decade of dysfunction, it's time to change. As we debate that veto today, those of us in favour of reform should be comforted by the support that the idea of reform has. A huge majority of the public get that the veto just has to go. A majority in every age group of polling gets that it has to go, and that's no surprise. Those people can see the consequences of it and the dysfunction that the veto has incentivised all around them. They see it in the health service collapsing in front of their eyes, in the generation of our young people leaving our shores. They see it in their pay packets that have fallen further and further in real terms, and they see it in their childcare costs that are just skyrocketing. While our government has sat back, or too often not sat at all, people have seen how their lives, in many ways, have been collateral damage for this deadlock. They see firsthand in their communities how a constant cycle of ransom politics just doesn't work. They see that the same people losing trust and confidence in our politics, and it is little wonder. They hear us talking about multi-year budgets, but they know that we're rarely here for multi-years. They hear us talk about programmes for government, but they know one hasn't been agreed since 2011. Their trust in politics has been pushed beyond breaking point, and on too many occasions to count now. Indeed, you could be forgiven as a member of the public for thinking that such dysfunction actually suits parties who would rather say no than say yes, who are content with feeding off tribalism and fractionalism instead of standing over a record of government in delivery. Because the truth is that good government is not built by historic events, and trust is not won through symbolic handshakes. Good government is a process that demands us all to commit to consensus and compromise over years of crafting peace. The same years that simply have not... Yes, of course.
Does the Minister agree with me that it's telling and disappointing that The member. The member agreed with me that it's both telling and disappointing that neither the First nor Deputy First Minister will not only promise not to collapse the institutions here again, but that neither could come to respond to today's debate.
And the member has an extra minute.
Thank you for the member for his intervention, and I suppose really that says it all. I understand that a veto is a really hard thing to give up, but the two biggest parties have told us that they're about delivery. The single biggest message that the First and Deputy First Minister could send is, if you're really committed to delivering for people here, it is to put down that veto and accept that no one should be able to exercise it again. That would be to act in the spirit of the agreement and our peace process. Without that, how can people believe you this time, when this place has collapsed so easily before? And if you do not have that commitment to write it down in the programme for government, then people will know what conclusion to draw. Finally, Speaker, I have heard some say that entering into any process of reform runs contrary to the Good Friday Agreement. I fundamentally disagree with that. I am profoundly grateful for the success of the Good Friday Agreement. I will never take for granted that agreement or the men and women who made that happen. They are the builders and the giants that we all follow. But the truth is, to review this agreement's outworkings is to fulfil the very spirit of that agreement and to stay true to the original intention of those builders. Change was always expected and indeed intended. To reform and review is to believe no less strongly in the agreement or the peace process. In fact, it is the same agreement that provides for reform and that expects and demands those who carry out the responsibility of preserving it to ensure that it works for the next generation. That's a generation that deserves stability in their government, that deserves hope for their future. The only way to guarantee that hope, and I believe, is to recommit to that agreement and reform the institution so that no one can ever pull it down again. Thank you, Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Sinead. And I call Kate Nicholl, please.
Thank you, Principal Deputy Speaker. When I was elected as an MLA, my first act in this chamber was to sign the register and designate as United Community. And it's always been strange to me that we're lumped into another group. We're not other. We're so much more than that. And then I took my seat and tried to elect a speaker, and I couldn't. And my cross-community vote and the cross-community votes of my cross-community party didn't count in that. And then I spent the next 2 years being an MLA but not able to legislate because one party has the power to bring everything down. My experience as an MLA has been severely hindered by flaws within the system, and we need to change them. I welcome the motion. I think it's important we're having this discussion today, and I'd like to focus my comments specifically on designation, which I would have liked to have seen referenced in the motion. It's a case that Alliance have been making for many years, the urgent need to change it. The Good Friday Agreement is precious, but it was designed to be a living document, to be the beginning rather than the end of a process. And in fact, to not move forward, to not change, is dangerous and damaging to the vision of the Good Friday Agreement. Society has changed dramatically since 1998. The number of Alliance MLAs on these benches is testament to that. And we are all given the label of other. We are many things. I am Zimbabwean, my mother is South African, my father is Irish, my children have Irish and British passports, I have them. Our identities are complex, and they shouldn't be barriers to overcome. They are the stuff of pluralism and vibrancy, and there's something to celebrate and respect. But the process of designation, when MLAs sign into the Assembly, is unnecessary. It embeds division and is part of what makes our institutions so unstable. When we are asked in this chamber to vote on a cross-community basis, our votes on these benches are treated differently, and my colleague Kelly Armstrong is particularly passionate about this and far more articulate on the subject than I can. We should not have the same weight
on a range of votes, including the election of a speaker, changes to standing orders, approvals to budget, is quite frankly untenable, and it's demeaning. It's demeaning to me and my colleagues. As Kelly pointed out, if it was in any other area, if it was any other aspect of someone's identity, it would be discrimination. Our society has changed, and our institutions must reflect that. The values of mutual respect, equality and partnership are infused in the Good Friday Agreement, and they should remain the driving forces of our politics. To fulfil those values, however, we cannot stand still. We must modify and update the functions of these institutions. Cross-community voting continues to treat cross-community parties as less than those who are nationalist or unionist. The continued use of designation is no longer tenable and has been for some time. And go ahead.
I agree with her, and I think we'll come on to talk about it in my wind about designation being something we need to have a conversation about. Would she agree, though, that in the short term, given there are other things, designation, how North-South works, how East-West works, that having an urgent priority on removing the veto is something that's very good to get rid of quickly? Some of those other things will take a little bit longer.
And the members an extra minute.
Thank you, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition. On the Alliance Party website, there is a document with proposals for reform. We published this in June 2022, and it details our short-term and medium-term changes in line of reform. It's something that we feel very passionate about, and it shouldn't just be something we talk about. We've actually laid out how we would achieve that. So yes, absolutely agree that there are different areas to focus on and how that would progress. The final point I wanted to make is one of the members from the DUP said that we should be discussing things that are relevant to Northern Ireland. I think this is so relevant. The fact that we've had no assembly, that we can just collapse this and have no ministers in place making local decisions for local people, looking at budgets, committees scrutinising, being able to ask questions, the impact it's having is huge. And that's not just on delivery. It has a psychological impact as well. People see a failed assembly and they feel like this place has failed, and it is not. This is a brilliant place to live. Our people are brilliant. There are wonderful opportunities. We're talented, creative, and we should be celebrating everything that is good. But the ability to collapse everything, the failure within the structures is something that needs to be addressed. So I would say it is very much relevant to this House. We will support the motion, and we will continue as the Alliance Party to do everything we can to progress reform. Thank you.
Jim Allister, please.
Since I first came to this House, I repeatedly have pointed out the unworkability of mandatory coalition. And every time I did, the most ardent defenders of Belfast Agreement devolution were the SDLP. It was the Holy Grail. It could not be touched. It was perfect. It was the ideal for us all. And those who dared to question it, well, they were some sort of outcast from the past. Yet here we are today, and lo and behold, SDLP calling for change. Mind you, the motivation, I think, is very suspect, because so long as the mechanisms of mandatory coalition were about protecting nationalism interests as a minority, then indeed they were the Holy Grail. But the moment nationalism is in the ascendancy in this House, and it may be the unionists who need whatever protection there is, then forget about it. Let's have reform. Let's have change. That has been the cause. So I think the motivation is very suspect indeed. We heard from Mr. O'Toole his worry that these institutions might collapse again. Well, Mr. O'Toole, don't worry about the leadership of the DUP. They've been captured. They are now protocol implementers. They are now acceptors of the REC border, of the fact that we're really governed by foreign laws we don't make and don't change. So don't get too concerned about whether the DUP will ever rediscover their principles. Under this current leadership, no chance. You can rest assured in that regard. You might, if it bothered you, be more worried about Sinn Féin, because, of course, to them, this isn't about making Northern Ireland work. This is about a stepping stone getting within touching distance of their goal, and it's quite clear from some recent Sinn Féin declarations that as soon as they arrive there, Stormont is over, it's gone. So I think I would reassure you, from my knowledge of what I observe in these benches, that the happy band in the main of the DUP will not be rediscovering their principles or pulling down these protocol implementing institutions. My goodness, you only have to look at the glee and delight of the Deputy First Minister as she trips around the publicity stunts with the First Minister as our unelected lady-in-waiting. To be assured that the DUP, having enthroned Sinn Féin, are very, very unlikely indeed to return to the principles that rightly took them out of this House 2 years ago, and which the dispensing of which shamefully brought them back in just a month ago. So I do fear that your concerns in that regard are misplaced, but if you have any concerns, probably not, nor probably your sister Nationalist Party Alliance have no concerns about when Sinn Féin reach the point of mission accomplished and therefore the end of any role for this institution. You may have reason for concern there, but you probably don't, because of course you're all on the same trajectory with the protocol and its implementers.
I call Jerry Carroll.
Deputy Speaker, I think it's fitting that the executive parties and former executive parties start off by offering public sector workers an apology for cutting their pay for over 2 decades. All those who have been in government at one point in time, Sinn Féin, DUP Alliance, UUP and SDLP, should be sorry for the destruction of our public services, which have been underfunded, understaffed, under-resourced by successive administrations. Deputy Speaker, but when I was younger, I was told by my ma, if you're sorry for something, you don't do it again. It means you've learnt a lesson from the past and you're ready to do better again in the future. 4 weeks into this new Assembly, and this administration is set to do the same disastrous deeds all over again and again and again. If the parties here were truly sorry for cutting public sector pay, then the first thing they would do is give public sector workers a real pay raise. Instead, this Assembly ran through a budget bill which only guarantees them a 5% raise, which is a cut in real terms with the rate of inflation. That's of course not to mention the spate of budget cuts and attack on public services that's going to come down the line. So whatever today's outcome, we need to be clear that if executive parties do not begin to address these issues, then they are not sorry at all for the harm that's done to our communities or our services. And like many motions in this Assembly before, Deputy Speaker, it will be simply for the optics, ruling by fooling once more. But Deputy Speaker, people before profit were one of the most strongest vocal critics of the DUP's boycott of the Assembly. It was self-serving and wrought untold misery on people across the North. But today's motion about reforming the Assembly fails to address the real elephant in the room. That is that these institutions, built and run on the basis of communal designation division, will always be prone to instability. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, a critical minority warned it would effectively institutionalise sectarianism, and that's exactly what has happened. And the DUP, when it collapsed the Assembly, was simply exercising its veto on power sharing as enshrined in Stormont's sectarian institutions. People before profit had attempted to amend today's motion to do away with communal designations and to remove the sectarian mechanisms that allow for day-to-day vetoes of Stormont's business. As we see it, the communal veto is not just about collapsing the Assembly. It is a sectarian mechanism that has always been used to deny democratic rights time and time again. We've seen it used under the guise of the petition of concern to thwart things like same-sex marriage, reproductive rights and Irish language legislation. And it is, Deputy Speaker, to the eternal shame of this Assembly that the Tories
under pressure from popular mass movements, were forced to legislate for these demands where Stormont had failed. A system that mandates parties to designate as unionist, nationalist or other assumes that there always is and always will be separate communities here, and those communities should elect the leaders to represent their supposedly separate interests. I am not another. I am a socialist, and I was elected on that ticket, and it's a disgrace to this House that me and others are designated offensively as others. Not only does this approach copper fast and sectarianism outside these institutions, but it's also based on an illusion. As well, the unionist and nationalist establishment parties here seem opposed in principle. They are always united when cutting workers' pay, impoverishing our communities and stoking communal segregation. And even if this motion passes, it will not begin to cure the sectarian rot at the heart of the northern state. The cure, Deputy Speaker, lies in working class unity. It's that unity seen amongst striking public sector workers that force the Assembly back to business. It is that unity which will uplift our communities. It is that unity which will overcome communal division as people, Catholic, Protestant, nun, migrant, finally stand up to Stormont together. And the contrived unity and offer in this motion today will not cut it, Deputy Speaker, because it is an attempt at unity imposed from above, and real unity and real change will either come from outside these institutions or not at all. I think working class communities must start and begin by opposing the pay cut offered to public sector workers and the punishing revenue raising measures that this executive wants to impose.
So I call Matthew O'Toole to wind on the motion. Matthew, you have 10 minutes, and if you take an intervention, you don't have any extra time, just to let you know.
Thank you very much for that warning, Madam Principal Deputy Speaker. Can I thank, first of all the members who have participated in today's debate. It was a wide-ranging debate, and I'll touch on as many key points as I can. I have to say, obviously, people won't be surprised. Nothing I heard from any side of the chamber today. I welcome the fact that we have at least two parties who support clearly what we're trying to do today. I'm not entirely clear what where Sinn Féin are on this, and I'm not clear. I am clear where the DUP are. I'll attempt to address some of the points that were raised. I will also start by saying I'm genuinely disappointed that the First and Deputy First Minister are not here to respond. Indeed, there's no Minister here to respond to this debate. I think that is an insult to this chamber, bluntly, and I think it is suboptimal at best, and I don't think it reflects the seriousness of this issue or the gravity with which the people of Northern Ireland view it. I am clear, we are clear, that today, the purpose of today's motion is not about assigning blame or having a fight over what happened in the past. But since obviously people have raised issues that happened in the past, I'll touch on a couple of those purely to draw reflections on them. Our motions today are about positive, constructive momentum behind reforming the institutions, not to remove the pluralist or power-sharing principles behind it, but to allow us to simply have a government. And what's so unacceptable about that? Why is veto necessary? Why is it necessary for people to have their identity protected, to abolish, to be able to take away the principle of government at all? Not just the principle, but the operation of government. To go through a few of the comments that were made in the debate, Deirdre Hargey mentioned the fact that the motion, she seemed to be in sympathy with some of the motion, but focused on the regressive austerity imposed by the Tory government. That is exactly right. And Deirdre would know, because she was Communities Minister and had to deal with a lot of that when she was in ministerial office. But what about the 3 years before that, when there was no Communities Minister to deal with the aggressive austerity being foisted on the people of the North by a Tory government and an austerity-obsessed Westminster? You cannot, on the one hand, in my view, argue that aggressive austerity from Tory ministers has left us, our communities, in a terrible place, and then say, but sure, we need to retain the right to collapse government here and give them the power to do what they like. The power we have at a devolved level is limited, both because of the mandatory coalition system and also because Westminster holds all the power. I agree, Deirdre, her party and I agree that we need to change that in the long term, and we need to have a new constitutional setup. But while we have the one we have at the minute, I think it's not defensible for us to simply say, well, we should be able to collapse institutions here. Jonathan Buckley, his former party leader, I don't know if he was involved in the defenestration of this particular former party leader, famously said it's good to have a bit of fun in the Assembly chamber, and that's what Johnny was doing when he made a series of bizarre claims about John Hume and Seamus Mallon apparently being not in sympathy with us reforming the institutions. John Hume and Seamus Mallon helped create these institutions along with David Trimble, along with John Alderdice, along with other Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. But yes, the SDLP were intimately involved and proudly involved in the creation of these institutions. They wanted the institutions to function. They wanted us to be here and to work, to spill our sweat, not our blood. So I will take no lessons, no preposterous, pathetic slurs from DUP MLAs about what John Hume or Seamus Mallon might have thought about us changing the rules, to be quite honest with you. Johnny also mentioned the SDLP were forced into this position by the electorate. Can I just, I've had to clarify this a few times. I am not denying the outcome of the 2022 election. We didn't get enough seats to qualify under the hunt for a ministry. Unlike others, we accept the outcome of elections, including your own party. We are here in opposition because that is the role we have after the election. There's no denying that, there's no cavilling about that from me, and we intend to do it robustly and constructively, whatever slurs come from different sides of this chamber. I welcome Paula Bradshaw gave a thoughtful assessment. I'm a bit of a geek. I'm not quite as geeky enough to have read the 20-year-old document, but I might pinch a copy of it afterwards. I'll come on. There are a couple of other comments made by other Alliance MLAs that I will touch on, just to give some balance. Doug Beattie is right when he talks about the fact that things were different in 1998. So a lot of the things we're talking about, a lot of the institutional issues we have, were things that were created in the context of a society that was emerging from a violent conflict. And before the violent conflict, we had a system of government which was genuinely based on excluding one entire community. Harry Harvey mentioned the principle of consent. I'm afraid, with respect to Mr Harvey, that this absurd conflation of consent with perfect consensus has been a hallmark of DUP arguments for the last lot of years, as people say in the countryside. Consent, by definition, I don't consent permanently to Northern Ireland being in the UK, nor will you, if there is ever, through the chair, if there is ever a referendum on a new Ireland, and I hope there will be, consent to it happening. That doesn't mean that you don't give consent to the institutions that exist to work through democracy, nor does it mean that everything in this chamber has to have perfect cross-community consent on everything. That's never the way it was designed. That was never the way it was supposed to work. With respect, again, there was a slightly preposterous reference to John Hume, which I've already dealt with. Kelly Armstrong talked about reform and AERC kicking the can down the road. That is one reason why we don't accept the idea that the Assembly Executive Review Committee is the best place for this discussion to happen, because it has a record of being, for fans of Charles Dickens, a little bit like the famous Chancery Court case in Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, where they sat for years and never reached a resolution. We need to have a resolution. We need to have momentum behind this. I'll come on and talk, because there were a couple of common threads through Alliance spokespeople, and I'll just address the designation point a little bit later. This was called by Mr Brett from North Belfast a stunt. Mr Brett is always, for a relative new MLA, he is a very persuasive and passionate speaker, and indeed one who is able to pull off quite remarkably brazen lines like that, given some of what the DUP have pulled over the last number of years. He mentioned there have been electoral issues for the SDLP. I'm tempted to say, no blank Sherlock. We know we're doing our job in opposition, and we're proud to be doing it, and we're going to keep doing it, no matter what the slurs come from different parts of the chamber. I will give way briefly, as I said I would.
Agree with me that every single DUP member who participated in this debate has contradicted the manifesto in which they stood to election to this House, because on page 41 it says, and I will quote, "We remain convinced that a voluntary coalition remains the best long-term option for government in Northern Ireland. We believe that this should be the basis of concise agreed coalition plan that can be subsequently augmented by a more comprehensive programme for government and supported by a weighted majority in this Assembly." They have advocated reform.
The member has been generous. The member has made a statement, and I think his point has been made. Nuala McAllister and Kate Nicholl both touched on the question of designation. The reason this motion doesn't mention designation is because I think we should prioritise up front. That's why the second motion later on, or the third motion we will debate, is focused on our ad hoc committee and getting consensus and agreement on the question of removal of the veto. I think it's really important that we try and keep up the momentum to take this one ingredient out, one toxic ingredient out of the mix here. And once we do that, then we can do a lot after that. That's why this first motion talks about broader reform in the programme for government, which could certainly include designation. Let me just say on the point of designation, I understand, particularly now there's an increased Alliance representation in the chamber, I understand some of the frustration around voting, and we are up for that debate. I do think historically it's important to say that I don't agree that designation in 1998 was the root of all evil. We need to be honest about where we were in 1998, but that's not to say that we can't look at it now. And look, we all have rich identities. I, for what it's worth, designate as a nationalist and a social democrat. I am a proud, and my party is a proud member of the Party of European Socialists. There is a lot more to me than simply my constitutional view, though proud and passionate though I am about it. So our identities are all complex, and I think we need to recognise that. The binary definition doesn't apply simply to those who are other, though I respect the argument that was made. Just to come back to this point again and again that was made, and Mr Allister made it as well, the SDLP, imagine the SDLP talking about changing the Good Friday Agreement. From the very beginning, we have talked about improving and changing where necessary, the Good Friday Agreement. What we have been opposed to has been hacking at the principles of power sharing, including at the St Andrews Agreement. I don't have time, I'm afraid, to give away. I would know, but I won't get an extra minute, so I won't. You will have time, hopefully, later on in the second debate on reform. What we have been opposed to is hacking away at the principles of power sharing, pluralism and partnership, something he, of course, has been delighted to do, to hack away at it, to object to it. And that's fine. That's his lookout, as they say. I don't go along, though he is a talented polemicist, I don't go along with somewhat vulgar and faintly misogynistic depictions of the First and Deputy First Minister. I don't think that's appropriate. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think we today have an opportunity to do something very important, which is to build a consensus around partnership, working together. It's ironic that it's the opposition, a constructive opposition, that is having to encourage the government to stay together and do a job for the people, but that's where we find ourselves. Thank you very much, everyone who participated. Let's make this place work, and I commend, once again, this motion to the Assembly.
Okay, I thank the member for bringing his remarks to a close. So the question is that the motion standing in the order paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary of any noes? No. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary of any noes? No. Okay, I heard you, Matthew. So, because question time begins at 2 o'clock, and rather than do the division now, it's clear we need one, so we're going to have one directly after urgent oral questions when the Speaker will do that. Okay, so just take a ease now until question time at 2. Thank you.
Order. Order. Members will resume their seats. The questions and the motion standing in the order paper be agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary, if any, no. Do we have tellers? Do we have tellers? That's us, really. Order. Tellers has been appointed as follows. Tellers for the ayes are Colin McGrath and Mark Durkin. Tellers for the noes are Paul Frew and Linda Dillon. Clear the lobbies. The Assembly will divide. Ayes to the right, noes to my left. Secure the doors. Votes for ayes was 47, votes for noes was 33. Sorry. Votes for the ayes was 33. Votes for the noes was 47. The noes have it. The noes have it. The motion falls. If members would take their ease while we change the table for the next item of business.